Who should be allowed to vote in U.S. elections? I'm not talking about people who surreptitiously voted. I'm not talking about voter fraud. I'm talking about legally who should be permitted to cast a vote. Now, there's an article making the rounds on social media. This is an article in the New York Times. It's a guest essay. It's written by a guy named Atosa Araxia Abramanian. Whoa. Anyway, this guy is a U.S. resident, which is to say a green card holder, but he's not a citizen. And he thinks that people like him, i.e. non-citizens, should be allowed to vote. So here's his article. There's no good reason you have to be a citizen to vote. Not just that there's reason to allow non-citizens, but there's no good reason you have to be a citizen to vote. I beg to differ. But let's explore his logic a little bit, because often on social media, conservatives will put these articles up or put the headlines up as if they are self-evidently absurd. And the idea is sort of like, can you take a look at it? It's ridiculous. But why is it ridiculous? What's ridiculous about it? That's kind of what I want to probe here. Now, the argument that he makes in this guest essay, this fellow named Abramanian, is he says, first of all, that he gives a couple of reasons why this is a good idea in his view. Number one, he says, it will give American democracy new life. Kind of a vague phrase, giving it new life. He goes, two, it will restore immigrants' trust in government. That's an interesting statement. He, after all, is a resident here, but you're not an immigrant until you become a citizen. The term is used much more loosely, immigrants crossing the border. No, those aren't immigrants, those are illegals. So we have, despite the promiscuous misuse of language, he thinks that immigrants will feel better about their government if non-citizens were allowed to vote. Here's one immigrant, Dinesh, who does not agree. And then he goes and, quote, it'll send a powerful message of inclusion to the rest of the world. Why? You think the rest of the world is going to go, man, you can be a Haitian or a Pakistani or a Brazilian and vote in America? The first question they'd have to ask is, well, if that's the case, why can't all those people vote in India? Why can't all those people vote anywhere else in the world? Why is it the case that most other countries limit voting to their own citizens, but here the United States has chosen to go a different route? Why does the world expect America to operate a different sort of democracy than other democracies around the world? No explanation given in the article. Now, somewhat disturbingly, this Abramanian fellow goes on to argue that there are some local elections in America. He mentions Tacoma Park, Maryland. He mentions some other towns in Maryland that actually allow non-citizens to vote in local elections, not in statewide elections, not in federal elections. He talks about the cities of Chicago, Washington, and Portland that are considering giving some extension of the franchise, and New York as well. Giving what they call immigrant voting rights, even though, again, these aren't really immigrants. Now, there's some kind of built-in assumptions here, and the biggest built-in assumption, this, by the way, is the assumption that always comes out whenever you hear the left and when you hear Democrats talk, is it's better ultimately to expand the franchise. Democracy is better if the people have a more direct and a greater say, if more people can kind of weigh in. And I actually want to push that logic to its conclusion and ask a very simple question. Why do we have representative democracy at all? Why don't the people, all 360 million of us, or at least all the adults, and we can include here citizens and non-citizens, or let's limit it to citizens. Either way, why don't the citizens directly participate in the election process? Why just vote every 2 or 4 years? If they want to decide, let's say, for example, the Green New Deal, why don't you send everybody a link and have them vote? Technology makes this possible. Maybe in the old days it was impractical. Oh, how are we going to get the opinions of 80 million people? But now it's very easy to do that. It'd be very possible to consult the entire electorate on every issue. You want to go to war? Ask the American people. You want to spend money on infrastructure? Ask the American people. But we don't do that. And the Democrats have not even proposed that we consider that, which is direct democracy. Now, all of that, the fact that we don't have direct democracy, raises the logic of why we have representative democracy. And if we just remember that logic or make it more explicit, we can see why this proposal from the New York Times makes absolutely no sense. The whole logic of representative democracy is it's based upon setting a much higher standard for the government than direct democracy. The idea is that the ordinary citizen is not wise enough to make decisions on behalf of the whole country. That the ordinary citizen is only wise enough to choose citizens wiser than himself or herself and entrust them with making decisions in our stead. So the founders believed that you could have a filtering process in which citizens choose representatives who would be wiser than the citizens themselves. Now, they also believe the citizens, though, need to have a certain level of wisdom to be able to make those choices. And this is why the founders believe that the franchise should be limited to people, first of all, to adults, but even the property requirements, the requirement, for example, that you have to own a certain amount of land. Today it's portrayed, this was just elitist, this was just racist. No, it was also intended very clearly to limit the franchise to people who had a stake in the system. In other words, if you were just a freeloader off the system, you wouldn't have any stake in maintaining fiscal responsibility. You're just there, in a sense, as a looter. You're just there to ultimately help yourself to the public trough. Why do you want people like that making decisions about how the trough should be handled? Why not have people who have a direct stake in the fiscal responsibility of the state being the ones who participate? So this was the original logic for representative government. And although the Democrats keep saying the more voters, the better, let's expand the franchise, notice they never say why. They never say why by itself expanding the franchise is somewhat better. I guess their only reason is this: if you let more younger people vote, if you let more illegals vote, if you let illegals become citizens and then vote, if you let non-citizens vote, well, that's going to benefit the Democratic Party, and that's all we need to know. And in fact, this is exactly what Abrahamanian says. He basically says, he kind of admits it. He says, it's time for Democrats to radically expand the electorate. He knows what he's saying. And then he goes on to say, quote, Democrats are likely to be the biggest beneficiaries of this change. So even though this is an argument that talks about a democracy, giving it new life, the rest of the world will admire us even more, none of this is really what this is about. What it's about is a kind of a crass move attempting to give a long-term advantage to the Democratic Party.